All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Sharif. I have Vinod here with me today. I'm sure most of you can read the title. You've probably read the abstract. Before we get started, I wanted to get a general consensus to understand the experience level of everyone in the room. If you're familiar at least with using Dynamics AX to publish services using the application integration framework, could you give me a raise of your hand? Nice. And if you're familiar with the Windows Azure cloud services that Microsoft provides, and in particular the Service Bus Relay, could you raise your hand? All right, a fair number. If you have actually used the Service Bus adapter that was released this past summer, could you give me a raise of your hand? Is that one back there? All right, great. So I'm going to go ahead and get started now. I think this is what they added. Disclaimer, they didn't really give me any points to talk on here. I guess you could read this when you're looking over the presentation at home. All right, so when we began, when we first thought about adding the services adapter to Microsoft Dynamics AX 2012 R2, we were trying to solve a problem. The problem was that using the services in AX, you could build business-to-business scenarios or even client-to-Dynamics AX service scenarios as long as you were inside of a CorpNet on your enterprise network. If you wanted to build client applications that could communicate through that to that CorpNet, you had to reconfigure your firewalls or change some security settings. We wanted to alleviate that problem for as many developers as possible. Lucky for us, Microsoft publishes a solution for us by way of the Service Bus adapter. So what we did is essentially update the application integration framework in Dynamics AX 2012 R2. We've added a Windows Service Bus adapter in addition to the NetTCP, HTTP, and other adapters that you're probably familiar with from publishing services within AX. Some additional topics we wanted to, some additional highlights are that there's no additional infrastructure required. We're going to touch on that later on as we go through the presentation and the demo. And that all of this, of course, relies on Microsoft working magic in the cloud. So the infrastructure components, you need Dynamics AX. That should be a given, pretty much understood. AX normally comes with, I think it always comes with IIS deployed. You're going to be using IIS to run through our solution as well. You'll need a Windows Azure subscription. I think they're running a 3-month free trial. They have been for a few years. I think that's still up and going. So if you wanted to try this solution when you got back to wherever you're from, you could just sign up for the 3-month trial and use our code samples and run through it. And as far as our solution, we use Microsoft ADFS as our identity provider. You'll see how we use that in the demo as we go forward.
Okay. So in Dynamics AX, you can write services in X++ and publish them as WCF services. And these can be consumed by clients within your corporate network over NetTCP or the HTTP binding. So what happens when your client is not within your corporate network and you have a mobile client, for example? So in those cases, the Service Bus, Microsoft Azure Service Bus is the one that helps with that kind of a problem. So the Service Bus has a relay service that allows you to host your service, WCF services, on your enterprise network and actually delegate the listening to the Service Bus running in Windows Azure. So you can do this now. Your clients can access your services running on your enterprise from outside your corporate network, and you can do this without opening up your firewall and without making any intrusive network changes. So what happens when you deploy a port and you select the Service Bus adapter? Yeah. Sorry. So over the firewall, and so what happens when you deploy the service using the Service Bus adapter? We use WCF relay bindings to authenticate and register the services to your address on the Service Bus. And at that point, your services are callable by any client over the internet. And in order for a client to be able to call that service, there needs to be authentication happening. So there's authentication required at two two different places. The first one is with the service bus itself, where the client needs to authenticate with the service bus and prove that it's allowed to make the call on that address. And the second is at the Dynamics AX logon level, where you need to actually authenticate the user and identify who's making the call, right? So let's take a look at what needs to happen for this to work. So the service bus depends on the access control service, Azure Access Control Service, or ACS, to actually authenticate the call. The ACS itself supports multiple identity providers. In the case of our demo and the code that we have in the download, we are using ADFS. So ACS is configured to use ADFS as an identity provider, and the service bus is a relying party. And the next configuration that is required is for ADFS to be configured to issue tokens for consumption by the service bus. Once this is done, and you've configured the relationships between the ACS and ADFS, and you've got your service deployed on Dynamics AX, listening for the calls. So the next step is for the client to actually make the calls. So the first step is that the client calls ADFS with the user credentials, and ADFS will return a SAML token once the user is authenticated, once the credentials are authenticated. Using this SAML token, now the client makes a call to ACS and gets back a simple web token. Next, the client calls the actual service on the service bus, passing in both the tokens that it got earlier, the simple web token and the SAML token. The simple web token is required by the service bus in order to allow the call to go through. And the service bus will actually consume that token and let the remaining part of the request pass through it and get relayed to the service on your enterprise. So what goes through that is your service request and the other token, the SAML token that you passed in a custom header. Now the reason you had to use the custom header is because once the service bus swallows that original token, there's no other way to authenticate the caller. So you need to pass that in a different header on the message. On the service side, as part of the authentication, we call a custom authentication component that's plugged in using the WCF config. Now the purpose of this component is to extract the token out of the header. Then it validates that the token is been issued by ADFS, and for that service bus address, it extracts the claims out of that token. Then it creates a claims identity and claims principal, and then sticks it onto the security context of the message before forwarding the call to the AOS. So by the time the call reaches the AOX, the user is identified on the header of the message, and AOS uses that user identity to make the call, to let the logon go through. And so that pretty much completes the entire flow, and the call returns the same way. So it's one thing to note here is that the initial configuration, that it looks like a lot of configuration that's required for ACS and setting up the ACS configuration on AX side, all that's a one-time thing. Once you set up that relationship and configure everything, you don't need to do that for every port that you deploy. So you can deploy as many ports on the same service bus. And also all this back and forth that's going on, once you get a token, then this token is going to remain alive for a particular lifetime, and you can cache that token and then just directly call the service on the service bus. All right, next.
All right, so I hope that gives you a good understanding at a high level of the solution we have and how it works to enable you to call these Dynamics AX services in the cloud. Next, we're going to move on to a demo. We're actually going to step you through some of the forms you'll use to configure the access control service on Azure, and then step into Dynamics AX to show you how we configure Dynamics AX to know to listen to the service bus relay. Before we do that, I know that the majority of the crowd has said that they aren't very familiar with the service bus relay, and I want to get some feedback or questions, things I should highlight as I'm going through the demo. Please use the microphone if you have any questions. If not, we'll just go ahead and proceed to the demo. And all right. So we have 4 major tasks we're going to complete. First, we're going to configure the Azure Service Bus Relay. This includes registering for Azure. I've already done that. I'm not going to show those steps. Creating a new Service Bus namespace. This is going to be our public URI that we're going to make service calls to through our client, as well as providing some configuration information related to, I think that's actually number 2 here, configuration information related to using Microsoft ADFS as my identity provider. Going to provide some information to the Azure Access Control Service portal. For the second part of the demo, Vinod is going to show you how to add the service bus information to Dynamics AX. We're going to deploy the service. It's a very simple service we're using. You're very familiar with publishing services in Dynamics AX, and you'll see that that pattern hasn't changed. And we have a simple test client that's just going to call the service to verify that it's working, of course, through the cloud. So let me go ahead and switch displays here. Okay. As we can see, this is my Azure subscription portal. I have selected Service Bus from the navigation on the left-hand side. You can see the Service Bus namespaces that I've already deployed. Now, instead of clicking on this guy, this name right here is the one we're going to use for the demo. I don't want to open his connection information up because he has some of our secret keys in there, but I'm going to show you how simple it is to create a Service Bus namespace of your own. So after selecting Service Bus from the navigation pane and clicking the Create button at the bottom, I can go ahead and create my Service Bus namespace. It needs to be unique, and I'm surprised that no one is still in this namespace yet. I'm going to select my region, hit this checkbox, and give Windows Azure a few seconds to new up this URI. It doesn't take very long, and I should have highlighted this before. Steps 1 through 3, the configuration I'm doing here on Azure, the configuration we'll do with the access control services, and the configuration that Vinod will be doing in Dynamics AX. All that is a one-time setup process. You create your Azure subscription, you create your Service Bus namespace, you set up your identity provider, Microsoft ADFS, and then you provide this information to Dynamics, and then that's it. You can just deploy your services on multiple ports after that. So I have my namespace created here. I'm going to click on the Connection Information button. Here you'll see some private information. I'm going to remove this namespace when the demo is over, so we shouldn't have to worry about that key. This link is important. This link takes you to the access control service that is bound to this Service Bus namespace. If you aren't familiar, each Service Bus namespace has a separate access control service namespace that's delegated to it, or a companion access control service namespace. So once I'm inside this portal, there are 3 major steps that I'll go through as part of this configuration. The first is to establish my identity provider. In this case, I'll be using Microsoft ADFS. So I'll go ahead and add Microsoft ADFS as my identity provider here. For this demo, I'm actually going to slap in Microsoft ADFS STS endpoint. This is a public endpoint. Paste this guy in here. I need to provide a display name. And another one down here. I think that's all the required fields. Go ahead and click Save on this guy. What I've just done here is I specified let me open that back up. The metadata endpoint that the ACS is going to listen to is going to download information from here. Information that says Microsoft ADFS supports these sorts of authentication mechanisms. I think even the thumbprint, which is important, is located at this URL as well. The rest of the fields are simply some text. They don't affect the behavior of your application. It's simply information that's displayed in the UI we have here and in other places. Let's see. The second most important part of this form is the relying party applications. We designate that the service bus is the relying party. This essentially establishes a relationship saying that the service bus is going to use Microsoft ADFS as or rather the ACS is going to use Microsoft ADFS as the identity provider to allow users to access the service bus, which is our relaying party. The reason this is checked by default, of course, is because I navigated from the service bus to get to this ACS portal. The reason it's here at all and it's optional is because you can use the ACS to have other relying party applications. In this case, we're using the service bus. All right, so the next step is to set up your relying party applications. I could have navigated by clicking on the service bus link in the previous page. All right, so from here you can see all of our information, all the required information has been entered for us. For the purposes of this demo and our solution, we do not need to add any additional information here. But here you can see the manifestation of the simple web token. I think it was token B in the diagram we showed before. This is the token format that the ACS is going to use to negotiate and authenticate with the service bus. You see you can also optionally specify a lifetime for that token as well. We make sure our Microsoft ADFS is checked as our identity provider. And the final step in ACS is to configure our rule groups. Now, I'm not sure if you all are familiar with this form and what this determines. The service bus supports three different sorts of claims. It supports send claims, listen claims, and manage claims. For the sake of our demo, we're only going to be using the send claim. But these claims, of course, affect not just the service bus relay, but they also affect how someone can make calls to the topics and queues that Windows Azure offers through the service bus as well. I'm not going to change any of these as they are now. In our documentation and our walkthrough, you see that we simply remove, I think, the send and the manage claims. We leave the listen one. Then we add a send claim of our own. We make sure we have the correct authentication protocol set up for that guy. As explained in the documentation, I already have a service bus set up and an ACS set up and configured correctly. We're going to be using that one going forward. And that service bus namespace is the one you see here, Contoso Mobile. And that is all we needed to complete for our Azure setup. I'll now have Vinod step into Dynamics AX to show you part of the rest of the one-time setup process.
So there is one more step that needs to be completed before this whole thing will work. Actually, two. Configuring ACS is one part of it, but there is also the part where you have to configure ADFS to issue tokens with the service bus, with your service bus namespace as the relying party. In our case, we go through our IT department, and in your case, whatever is your IT department, they'll probably do that work for you. So that needs to be completed as well, in addition to setting up the configuration on ACS. So can you use a mic, please? Sorry. Oh, okay.
Oh, the resolution?
Do you?
Yeah, just go to let's try this. Hope this works. I could do the resolution or it's because I'm remoting it won't let me do it. This is going to log me out, log me back in, I think, though. For the sake of not disturbing the stability of the demo, I'm not sure what logging out will cause to happen. Is it just hard to see in the back? Maybe Vinod can, I guess, audibly call out the menu items he's clicking on as he goes through this. Hopefully the forms we open are a little more visible.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So I can talk through where I am in the configuration. So since you're familiar with the AIF services framework, you should be familiar with these forms as well. So once you have set up your configured ADFS and ACS and set up all your relationships, the next part of this is to actually configure Dynamics AX to use those settings, right? So as I mentioned in the flow, one of the things that is required for authentication is a custom authentication component. Now, since ACS supports different identity providers and you can do things so many different ways, we do not ship any out-of-the-box components. We have got a component which is part of the download for the sample scripts, and it's part of the samples that can be downloaded, and the one that we are using for this demo, and that is built to support ADFS. Now, what the custom component does, and what you can write your own custom authentication component to support a different authentication type, what it does is to validate that the claims are valid make sure that the token you're receiving on the message comes from your trusted source, in this case ADFS, and that the user and extract the user identity and set the claims on the header. That's pretty much the purpose of that component. So before you can configure the service bus information in AX, you need to make sure that that component is ready and built and ready to go. So once that is done, you need to register that component with AX. In the download, there is a sample script which shows you how to do that. It basically calls an API and passing in the component information, and it registers that. So there's two parts of that component. One is to show any configuration input that you need to get from the user, and the other is a runtime component that will automatically get deployed to all the places, to all the locations where the service is deployed. So in the setup form, in the setup screen, when you go to the services and AIF part of it, there's a new entry added, new menu item added for the Azure Service Bus configuration. So I'll read out the entries over here so you can understand. So this is the place where you come and do your configuration. Again, this is one time. You don't need to do it every time. Once this is done, you don't need to do it for any other port deployment. You can deploy as many ports as you want. And once you come here, the information that's required here is number one, the Azure Service namespace. You created your namespace in the previous part that Sharif showed. When you do your configuration there's also a connection key information that is required to publish your service there. That key information is available in that Service Bus configuration form. So you have a namespace name, the key name, key issuer name, and the key secret. All that information is available on that site, on your Service Bus configuration site. The next field is the website. Because we use IIS as a host, and we already support deploying to IIS, you need to select the website where you want to deploy your service. And that's your intranet site, but from there it's going to be available on the cloud. So select your website. The next thing is to select your authentication component. In this case, we only have one. So we've already registered the component, the sample component here. And the last piece of information here is an RSA key container name. Now, why is this required? So you have in this form a lot of confidential information because you have your key, the key issuer name, key issuer secret, and all this information can be used to actually publish services in your name on the cloud. So that's confidential information. So when you actually deploy the service, all this goes into your web config file, and the key is it's a machine RSA key, machine level key, and all this information gets encrypted into the config file so that no one can just open it up and get access to that info. So that key is mandatory there. And if you want to provide information on configuring that, any additional configuration for your component, that is, you can do that too. So in this case, we are, in the case of our component, what we do is ask for the thumbprint of the ADFS that will be used, the ADFS certificate that's going to be used for signing the token, because when the token is received on AX, on IIS, you need to make sure that the token was issued by your ADFS. So the thumbprint information is stored there in that configuration. And when you deploy a port, all this stuff, all this information is going to be packaged up, and the configuration file is going to be built up using this information, and the secret information is encrypted, and then the port will be deployed to IIS. So once you're done with this one-time config, then it's just like deploying any other port on using the services. So you go to the inbound port form, and I'm just creating a new port, new USB port. The difference now is that when you're selecting the adapter, the drop-down shows your Windows Azure Service Bus adapter. That's what you select. And when you enter the address, the drop down is going to show you the Azure Service namespace, Azure Service Bus namespaces that are available. If you've got more than one, they all will show up here. In this case, let me pick up the real one. And pretty much that's it. Now you select, now everything from, I think I already have this port, so let me create a new one. New SP port 2 service bus. Okay, save it, and I'll add, I'll just select the service operation from the AIF user session service because that's what our test client is using. It's just a console app. Add it here. That's it. And that's it. Just activate the port. In this case, it might take a little while because I think Sherry's machine is a bit slow.
I'm very stingy with my RAM on my virtual machines.
But
so, yeah, while this is deploying, I guess this is pretty close to the end of the presentation. After this, we'll show you the test client just to verify that what we've been doing here isn't hocus pocus. If there are any questions you have so far on what we've demoed, please step up to the mic and voice those concerns, any feedback. I believe we had one user in the back that said they've actually used this before. Were you able to make it this far, at least?
No.
Oh, you can communicate upwards, you said? All right, well, maybe as we move into the Q&A session, you can give us a few more details. We can help you on that. Any other topics, anything else we should clarify from what we've touched on so far?
Noticed you're using a level 3 digital certificate. If you wanted to use a digital certificate on IIS, how would you propagate that out to the service bus in Azure?
What we are not configuring any certificate over there. We are basically got the secret information that we get from the service bus configuration. That's there in the binding, and that basically generates correct information to register the service up to the cloud.
So
you're talking about the certificate that is used by ADFS. Is that the one that you?
I'm talking about IIS, a certificate. So unless you're using a self-signed certificate, if you wanted to use a published level 1 certificate, so I'm at...
The IIS itself is not directly exposed outside.
Right, so then it won't be an authenticated service, right?
It's the service basically is hosted on Service Bus. So you don't have to provide an internal certificate for Service Bus to use.
Yeah, but wouldn't it resolve, right? So when it comes through the service bus to IIS, if we're using a public certificate,
yes,
say issued by VeriSign, right? It would come back.
So yeah, in that case, when it's coming back here to verify the signature, we use the thumbprint from the from Microsoft ADFS or your corporate ADFS. So that's the information, whatever that is using that information, we get from the thumbprint from there, and we use that in the configuration.
So and I'm asking just because I don't know. So it will come back validated at that point. Because if you had a public key, where would you install it? So if somebody wanted to spoof you, right? So I'm a big company. I published out, let's say, a credit card service, right? To where I want somebody to actually, or I have I don't know, some sort of external service that I want to push in, and I want it to go through my domain. And so you have the digital certificate from, let's say, VeriSign that says this is my domain, validated. If I'm posting over HTTP post, right, through 443 traffic, it's going to hit some certificate. It's got to validate. Where would that certificate hit?
I'm not sure. Let me take that offline with you.
Yeah, that'd be fine. Okay. I mean, I'm just saying, if you're going to really publish an enterprise public service that somebody could attach to, I don't know the answer. That's why I was asking. Hoping you guys would. So.
Is that a question of authenticating the service calls coming in? I think we're using the thumbprint to verify the user is
Yeah.
who they say
No,
they
no,
are.
the other way. The user knows what they're hitting,
Oh.
right? So let's say you publish to your service isn't going to an IP address. It's going to a domain. Let's just say webservice.contoso.com, right? You need to be able to authenticate that URL is correct. And the way we do that
I
is through a
see.
level 1 digital certificate.
Yeah,
So
in this case, it's going to be on the service bus, so that's going to be the service bus's address. It's not going to be any other address. The URL that's formed, for example, if, when I close this.
Does it mean that you need to buy another certificate and apply it to the service bus? Because that would be URL you keep.
No, the URL is your service bus, it's part of the service bus itself. So let me read out the address. So your namespace is plugged into it, but the base URL is servicebus.windows.net. So that's an Azure address that you're hitting.
But you can
You
done
can't
it
select
enough to
something
where
else.
You
Sorry?
can reroute right through to. I mean, you don't have to use the Azure,
You'll have to use the base part of the URI.
right? But you can resolve to it, right? So you don't have to. I mean, otherwise,
It's just relaying the service call.
Right.
I don't think it's necessarily a mapping of a URI to your service.
okay. Well, because every time I've ever tried to relay,
Mm-hmm.
and you have a digital certificate, it fails, right? Because then you're relaying,
I see. Yeah, I think it's because they expect to be the public endpoint.
right?
But I guess what you're saying is they may not provide a solution for saying, I want you to verify the Azure public endpoint,
Right.
as if it was my own.
Right, and then I guess that's the question, isn't it? So,
Yeah,
okay, thanks.
that's a good point.
You just can follow up on that. So so at this point the service is deployed, and as I just mentioned, the URL is going to be on Azure. So that's the base URL is an Azure Service Bus URL, and your namespace is a prefix in that. And your port information is going to be part of it's going to be appended to that base URL to form your service address. So any number of ports can be deployed to that. The WSDL is going to be accessible for your internal developers on your IIS site itself. So they can just add a reference to that, generate the proxies, and write the code. And that's pretty much takes care of the deployment. And
Show the website first.
sorry,
Azure.
you want to show that?
Sure. This is just an additional step you would normally take after deploying your port.
Yeah.
You can come back to the Azure portal. I believe if we refresh this, we'll see the port name. Was it SB port 2?
SB port new 2.
That should appear in
new
this
SB
list
port.
here. Did the web page fail to? Oh. Oops. Takes a few seconds normally, but I think we should expect to see it here. If we won't see it here, then our test client won't be able to hit it. So this is a good way of validating that your port has been deployed successfully. You close the info log.
Well, if it doesn't come up here, that means that there's something wrong with the connection, and we'll have to go back and look up the logs and check out why it's not showing up there.
So before we
need
step
to
into the test
open up
client,
that, right?
so this is the guy we're going to be using, the one that says Contoso Mobile here. The one Vinode just deployed.
We need to open that to see the relays.
Oh, you're right. This isn't even
Yeah,
where you'd
this is in
visually
the
see the
same
relays.
place.
Sorry about that. In the entirely wrong form. So here's your new SP port 2, and here's the one you deployed, I think, accidentally.
Yeah, that was the earlier one. So
All right, so these are some of the ports you deployed. I think for the test client, we're going to be using the one called demo port. I think Vinode will be able to show you that as we open the client and just give it a run.
Yeah, so there is, as part of the download, there is a sample component for ADFS, and there's also a test client that shows different ways that it can be called, and how to get the SAML token, how to call ACS, and how to call the service bus. And this has already been configured with a pre-created port. So essentially, the very first time during warm-up might take a little while. So it's called ADFS, it called ACS, now it's calling the service bus for the information, and there you go. So you have the user session service call with the identity of this particular user. So that's it for the demo, and any other questions?
Sure.
Sure.
This doesn't seem to be used in the mobile
All right, so the question was, this does not seem to be used by the mobile connector. If I understand correctly, you're referring to like the RapidStar connector? That little...
The time and expense.
Oh, the SI apps, time and expense. They have some additional requirements. We actually worked with them as we were developing the solution. We met with them several times to gather their requirements. Their requirements were a little more expansive, and they had built forth a solution. I believe they had a solution in place before we even released this one. So they wanted to continue developing along their own path for their own solution. I don't believe their solution.
They have additional requirements for different type of clients, different REST services, and other types of things that we don't support. So, and with their what their solution does is take care of their requirements, but it's pretty much tied specifically to their requirements. So you need to actually write code to consume more services. While here it's more of an automated way where once you plug this in, you can deploy any number of services.
Yeah, I don't believe that their solution is really expandable. I believe they provide, and I think our documentation, we've released a joint white paper on this where we go through the pros and cons of using the Azure Service Bus Adapter versus what they've done for time and expense. And there we outline the pros and cons. I believe also in there you'll find that while they'll provide something to you that works for their time and expense apps, if you want to build something similar, you pretty much have to build it from scratch. This is a way of doing it, getting you up started with a simple app with just configuration for the most part. Any other questions? Come on, there have to be more questions, guys. Sure.
You're using ADFS to authenticate.
Yes.
Okay, so that maps to an AX user, which is on your local AD.
Sure,
So,
sure, sure.
sorry.
So you're using ADFS.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You log in as admin,
Yeah.
maps it to admin. So therefore, ADFS creates the token on your local AD to say that I am the user admin in your test app.
So the ADFS account is mapped to the admin MBS AX account, AX user. So in this case, our actual user account is Redmond MBS user 2 is the Windows identity of that account, and that has been mapped to admin on this particular. It's on Cherry's local box. That's what it maps to.
Okay, like mobile. So the question is, what if you want to have a mix of claims-based authentication and the ADFS authentication at the same time? So you want to have non-AD accounts using your application, like you can do with claims-based?
You can have non-ADFS users using this. The only thing is that you will have to write your own component to handle that particular kind of token and extract the claims and set the identity on the security context. And that's the thing that the sample component shows you how to do it for ADFS. You'll have to do something similar for the other identity providers that you want to use. I'm assuming you're still talking about calling over the service bus, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you have a different identity provider that can be used, so you will have to then modify that component to figure out what claims you need to extract, get the user identity out and stick it on the security context. And you can, AX does support different claims-based users, so you can map it to one of those
AX
users.
will know that's a claims-based user, not an AD user when it comes in.
So yes, so the AX, there are two types of users. So you have AD users and claims-based user. You can select a claims-based user, correct?
Okay.
Any other questions? Maybe from the customer who has actually used the Service Adapter? No more to share? All right, well, to follow up on the last question, I believe it deserves a little more explanation, maybe a little further. The question was mainly around using other identity providers.
Yeah.
One thing we should highlight is that I believe currently the Access Control Service, I think it offers just 4 different source of identity providers, either the Microsoft ADFS, I think, I opened the portal, I believe Google, Facebook, and Windows Live was the default one. So these are the ones supported by the ACS, and of course the ACS is what's used to authenticate calls to your service bus. It may be possible to remove the ACS altogether, and then I'm not sure how you would maintain the authentication of calls to your service bus. You'd probably get a lot of attacks.
No, you
that
can't
way.
remove ACS. You need to go through ACS for the service bus call.
Always? Okay,
Yeah.
okay, that's fair.
Because the service bus just relies on ACS for the authentication. So whatever ACS supports is the only thing that's going to work for the service bus.
I see. Well, the ACS, as we said before, supports those identity providers, and I believe most of them do require some sort of browser-based redirect passive authentication. Using Microsoft ADFS, we were able to achieve active authentication. So if you do want to use a separate identity provider who's not Microsoft ADFS, you'll also have to think about how am I going to do this in a non-browser-based client, if that's the sort of client you're building. I think most users, if you're building B2B scenarios, you have your WCF services, shouldn't be an issue for you. You should be able to follow the patterns we set forth here. Any other questions, points of feedback? Sure.
Could you please explain a little bit what these Azure relays are? Are these only for tunneling the firewall, or is there anything more?
So the Azure Relay Service is the basic purpose of that is so you can have your services running within your enterprise and actually expose it to the internet, so clients which are outside your Cortnet, right? So what it does is we use relay bindings, WCF relay bindings that work with the relay service. So your service actually runs on your machine within your enterprise. But the listener for that is actually, once it starts up, the bindings will connect to the service bus relay service on the cloud, and over there they actually open up, it's an outbound socket connection to the relay, and then they open up they start up the listeners over there on that address for your service. And it's basically a bidirectional connection, so when they're sitting there and a call comes to the listener address, it will forward the call to the listener, it'll forward the call down to your service. So essentially, it relays the call down to your service which is running on premises. So its purpose is to relay any external facing calls down to your internal.
Is there any other advantage other than crossing the firewall using this relay?
I believe that is the main purpose of it. I'm not sure if there's other uses, because the service bus itself supports other features. There's queues, topics, events, and all the things, and this is just one of the features that it supports, the relay service.
Yeah, the Azure guys did a pretty good job of explaining how this all works end to end. It's not much more complicated than that. It's simply just a way of relaying some cloud service calls to your WCF service, wherever it lay. But yeah, I do encourage you, if you're interested in more, there's a lot more than what we have to offer. Azure offers a lot more of the topics and queues, even some REST-based endpoints. So please do give that a look. Just visit their website, browse their documentation. All right. Anything else? Any other questions? Comments, feedback, points of interest? Nothing that popped into your head as you were wondering, would this be possible? Or these guys are doing this. What do you think about that? Anything? All right, if not, how do I get back to the presentation here? Do you know which button it was?
Yeah, this one.
All right. The rest of the deck is mainly some slides that we realized we didn't need if we were going to go through the demo and explain these to you in person. But they do touch on a few of the things we've already explained here. There's no additional information here. We talk about the service bus, its purpose, how authentication is handled in this slide. We go over the high-level steps. As we mentioned before, there's just some one-time configuration with ACS, ADFS, Dynamics AX, and then you just deploy your services and your ports after that. Do they make these slides available? Do you guys? I think they make them available online. And we should have, I'm not sure if it's in this version. This isn't the only documentation we have. You don't have to go through the PowerPoint slide and look at the demo to figure out how to do this yourself. I don't believe they're at the end of this presentation, but we do have some links to some white papers that actually go very in-depth on building out the solution. They also touch on how to do the ADFS setup if you don't happen to have some system admin to do it for you. They touch on how to install one of those from scratch, do all the certificate stuff. It's pretty in-depth. It'll hold your hand all the way through. And of course, me and Vinod are here to help you guys. We really want you guys to uptake this. If you find any blocking issues or if you're curious about how to perform some specific scenario, please let us know. But as I said, if you download the slide from whatever share they've been uploaded to, I'm not sure of where the share is located or if they're on USB sticks. You should have the URLs to these places. If not, I believe you can simply search them. If you search Dynamics AX and
Service bus.
Service Bus, you'll find it on Bing. All right. If there are no other questions, any last-minute questions, we'll bring the session to a close. Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to hearing
Thank
more
you.
from you.